Do you fear the unknown? Or do you run into the dark abyss to greet it? Welcome to a special spooky season edition of True Drew Podcast, where we'll be discussing Nancy Drew books of a ghostly nature. So if you enjoy strolling through graveyards at night, whispers through the fog, the creak of a footstep on the stairs, or the chill that runs down your spine, you've come to the right place. So sit back and relax, if you can. Lock your doors and prepare yourself for some very haunting mysteries. Hey guys, and welcome back to another bonus episode of True Drew Podcast. This is the last Halloween edition episode in this 3-part series that I've been doing, and I hope you guys have enjoyed these. It was so fun to talk about some spookier stories in the Nancy Drew universe, and these short stories have just been really entertaining to me, so I hope you guys have enjoyed them. So for this final Halloween episode, we're going to be covering the Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys Campfire Stories book. So this book was published in 1984, and apparently, according to Google at least, this is one of the more rare books because it only went through one printing, one edition. So I just happened to find it in a lot of books that I bought online, and I thought, oh, this sounds really cool, like these might be kind of spookier, stories that we would talk about around a campfire, so I thought this would tie in really well with these Halloween episodes. Another interesting thing about this book is that there's actually a foreword to a campfire organization, a group called Campfire, and I had never heard of it before, so I started doing some research, and they branched off from what was originally called the Campfire Girls, but it's like a youth developmental program, like it's a non-profit, kind of like the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts. So one thing that you're going to pick up on in these 6 short stories within this book, there are a lot of mentionings of this campfire group, or they'll be like, oh, this character was the campfire leader, a campfire kid, so it's just a theme that runs through this entire book. So here are the 6 short stories in this Campfire Stories book that we're going to be covering today. There is Northwoods Celebration, The Perfect Prince, The Haunted House, they had to say it twice, I guess it's super haunted, Secret of Hawk Canyon, False Accusation, and The Abominable Snowman. Now, as far as the book cover for this Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys Campfire Stories book goes, I also posted this on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, if you'd like to see it there, but it's a red book. It's got a vignette on the front. It looks a lot like the Wanderer editions of the books, and Nancy's in front of this campfire. We have Frank and Joe Hardy because they're in this book, and they're giving this woman a birthday cake. It looks like they're having a campfire celebration, which is in one of the stories, and there's a full moon in the background with a shadowy figure running across it. So the funny cover spoof that I came up with is the Bigfoot / Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts birthday party, because that honestly looks like what's going on this cover. We've got a birthday cake, we've got these scout kids, they're campfire kids, but then we've got this shadowy figure running across in the background, and it's probably just a person, but I like to think that he's Bigfoot. And if I had to give this book cover a rating, I would give it a 2 magnifying glass rating. It's okay. It's not the coolest cover, but it is interesting. There's some things going on which are kind of cool to look at. So now, I guess without further ado, we'll jump into our first short story, Northwoods Celebration. So some of the characters that we encounter in this first short story are Eloise Richter, who is a friend of Bess and George, Frank and Joe Hardy, they're in every short story in this book, Harvey Pendleton, who is a friend of Eloise's, Andy York, who is a camp kid, and Benjamin Richter, who is the nephew of Eloise. So here's a brief synopsis of the Northwoods Celebration. Nancy, Frank, and Joe go to join Bess and George at a campfire function where a Miss Richter keeps having accidents befall her. What's going on, and can Nancy and the Hardy Boys solve the case? So our story starts with Nancy and Frank and Joe Hardy driving through the mountains of Maine, and they're going to meet Bess and George for a ceremony put on by this campfire organization near Lake Sebago. And Bess and George's friend Eloise Richter will be there, and Nancy explains that they're invited to the ceremony and celebration, and Frank is disappointed because he thought there was a mystery, and Nancy assures him there is, but George and Bess couldn't explain it over the phone. So when they arrive arrive at the lake, Bess says that she and George are worried about Eloise's mental capabilities. So she's almost 75 years old, but she's been slipping up and hearing and seeing things that other people can't. And just before everyone arrived, Eloise left a note saying she was going to see her friend Harvey Pendleton on Bear Island, which is nearby. But when Bess called Harvey's housekeeper, he says Harvey isn't there. So Miss Richter went out in a speedboat on the lake, and George is in a canoe out looking for her because she's concerned. And soon enough, George and Miss Richter both show up in the boat, towing George's canoe. And George says that Miss Richter ran out of gas, but she insists that she put gas in the tank before she left the dock. And so she also says that Harvey called her and said he was sick, and that's why she went to visit him, because she was concerned. But when they examine the gas tank on the dock, it's full instead of empty, as it should have been. So Miss Richter is visibly frustrated. She's like, I know what I saw. I know what I did. I put gas in the tank. I'm just telling you, that's what happened. And so she goes to lie down because she's just frustrated that nobody believes her. So Bess and George say that Miss Richter and a kid at camp whose name is Andy York have also claimed to hear a wolf in the nearby area, but nobody else has heard it. So there's just a lot of things pointing to, maybe this woman has a little bit of a case of dementia, maybe she's not remembering things properly, but it would be really frustrating to know that you did something and all signs point to the opposite of what you're saying. So next, Frank and George examine the boat and the gas tank because they're wondering if there might be something more to this, because Miss Richter was just so insistent that she filled the tank up. And so they discover that someone cut the gas gauge stick out of the boat, and they filled the gas can on the dock after Miss Richter left to make her feel like she was losing her mind. But why? So the next thing to happen is Miss Richter goes missing while she's preparing dinner for everyone, and everyone finds that she's fallen down the steps of the root cellar. She was going down there to get potatoes or some ingredients for the dinner, and Frank and Joe examine the bottom step because Miss Richter said it broke underneath her. I mean, she's a pretty spry woman. She goes out in a speedboat, she gets around, and she's fairly active, so she's like, yeah, that step broke. That's what made me fall. And so they look at it closer, and they find a new wood step, and the broken one is in the corner. So someone changed it out. Someone repaired the step while Miss Richter was laying there unconscious. How messed up is that? And the fact that they did that, like they were doing that explicitly so she would seem like she was crazy, because she was like, no, it was a rotten floorboard. It was, it wasn't stable. That's why I fell. So somebody did this to make her look crazy. So everybody helps Miss Richter up the stairs and they go and eat dinner together. So everyone at this camp is preparing this play to be put on for Miss Richter because it's her 75th birthday, and it's also the anniversary of the Campfire organization being founded, but everything keeps going wrong with this play, almost like it's being sabotaged. So at this point in the mystery, Miss Richter mentions casually that Carson is coming and he has some important papers for her. So file that away for later. Now, Andy York, one of the Campfire kids in the group, has a present for Miss Richter since it's her birthday, and he asks to hide it in Nancy's room. And while he's doing this, he also mentions a man, Miss Richter's nephew, used to stare at the house, which is really weird. So that's kind of a weird detail to mention, but this kid picked up on it, so Nancy's kind of like, why would he be staring at the house, and does it have anything to do with these important papers that her dad is bringing to Miss Richter? Now, sure enough, after Andy shares this little tidbit of information, he and Miss Richter go missing, and Nancy and everybody else goes out looking for them. So while they're out combing the woods and searching for them, they find dog tracks and footprints, and then they see two men trying to set fire to the property. So they chase the men off before they can get a really good fire started, and Andy York comes out of nowhere and he says they hit him and tied up Miss Richter. So the group is able to rescue Miss Richter and they go to the play, and it turns out that one of the men was her nephew, Benjamin, who was mad and wanted the property for himself. So Miss Richter was going to give the land to the Campfire group, and he was not happy about that. So at the play and at the ceremony and her birthday, Miss Richter wills the land to the Campfire group, gets a book of paintings of the play, like they sketched out every act in the play, I guess, and then the bad guys are caught. So as far as a What's Cooking segment goes for the Northwoods celebration, we had a mentioning of salads and sandwiches at the camp. Now on to our next story, The Perfect Prince. And And no, before you get too excited, it's not Frank Hardy or Ned Nickerson. Now, some of the characters we encounter in this short story are Monica Lester, Prince Rudolph, Mac and Edgar, who are bodyguards to the prince, and Samantha Nelson and her son Jasper. Here's a quick synopsis for The Perfect Prince. Nancy and the Hardy Boys are asked to come to a friend's estate to protect a visiting young prince when he's kidnapped. Can they find him and solve the case? So Nancy, Frank, and Joe are asked to help protect Samantha Nelson and her son Jasper by Monica Lester. And Samantha is Monica's old roommate, and she married Prince Rudolph of this fictional country called Calais. I couldn't help but wonder if Calais is anywhere close to Centrovia, that fictional country from the Scarlet Slipper mystery. So now Samantha is royalty. She wasn't royalty before, and her son Jasper has been nicknamed the Perfect Prince because he always seems to be on his best behavior. So Nancy, Frank, and Joe arrive at the Lester estate, and they meet 4 or 5 Campfire kids who are there, and they're just there to like entertain Jasper, I guess, but they're painting canoes. I don't know, the way that this book depicted it, you know, these kids are here to entertain Jasper. I was afraid he was going to be a spoiled brat, but he's actually fairly normal, even having been a prince for his entire life. So shortly after Nancy, Frank, and Joe arrive at the estate, this limousine comes up, and Samantha, Jasper, and their security get out of it. And the royal family's security guards, Mac and Edgar, are super rude to Nancy, Frank, and Joe. They're like, what are they doing here? They're not supposed to be here. We haven't vetted them. And Monica says she asked them to be there. She's like, I trust them, so you guys should too. So when all the Campfire kids go down to the lake with the canoes, Edgar rudely shoves past Nancy and basically says they've got this. And Nancy coldly tells him that she has her own job to do, but the book says Frank and Joe start to step forward, anger blazing, to defend her. I thought some of you Francie or Jancy shippers out there would appreciate that. It's funny though, because the little prince, Jasper, tells Nancy not to worry after he witnesses this, and he says he'll sneak away from his guards later anyway. So later in the day, Nancy bruises her foot playing water polo, so she has to ride a horse on the group's hike, and they encounter a blonde woman in the woods with a pair of binoculars. Nancy is instantly on alert and suspicious, and so she tells the woman, "You're on private property," and she says, "Oh, I was just bird watching and I didn't know," and then she leaves. So when Nancy relays this to Joe, he says that she sounds a lot like the woman who was talking to the kids the other day, and she apparently had some bird watching books, and Nancy tells the guards about it, but they don't seem concerned and say they've been watching the prince his whole life and basically for her to back off. So the next morning, Jasper's mom, Samantha, comes downstairs and she's really upset, and she says she found a picture of a hawk on Jasper's pillow and Jasper is missing. And Candy, one of the Campfire kids, speaks up and she says, Jasper did it. And so Nancy asks her to elaborate and explain what she means, and she says he's the treasure and they have to find him, like it's a scavenger hunt. Well, he did say he was going to sneak away from his guards, so Nancy, Frank, and Joe are discussing their next move, and they remember there's a place nearby called Hawk Hollow, and so they go there and find their next clue, which is a picture of a deer tied up. So this next piece of imagery is just too hilarious, but Joe, according to the book, was pretending to be a deer, and the kids tied him up the other day, and so Joe's like, maybe he went back to where we did that. So they go into the woods to where Joe was pretending to be a tied up deer, and that's when suddenly Nancy spots the blonde woman again. So Nancy's convinced that there's a road onto the property that the blonde woman has been using, so she, Frank, and Joe get in their car and go check it out. And the woman passes them in her car going in the opposite direction, so they chase her to a mall. So Frank watches her car while Nancy goes into the mall with Joe. And so Nancy sees the blonde woman go into a fitting room that has no other exit, so she decides that she's going to stand guard and wait for her to come out. So Nancy stands there and waits and waits and waits some more. And 48 minutes later, Joe comes and finds her and asks what she's doing, and Nancy checks the fitting room, and it's empty. So the woman must have disguised herself and snuck out right past Nancy. So Nancy and Joe go back to Frank, and he's at the woman's car, and they find a drawing of Jasper's in the back seat. And this time the drawing is a horse with squiggly lines that look like water. And they take prints of the car's tires so they can see if it matches up with the car tire marks that they found on on the property. And while they're driving away from the mall, Joe says he got a call from Samantha, and she says she got a call asking for ransom money for Jasper's return. Looks like those professional bodyguards didn't have it handled after all. So Nancy, Frank, and Joe go check out the cabin the Campfire group found a few days earlier to see if there's any clues that were overlooked, and they find another drawing that Jasper made of two men and a pickup truck, and they also find tire tracks around the cabin that look like they could have been made by a pickup truck. So at this point, the three of them figure out that the horse and the water clue is Seahorse, and they find a Seahorse motel nearby. So they stake out the motel, and they see the blonde woman and two men in a pickup truck, and they figure out which room Jasper and the bad guys are in. So in order to get a closer look, Nancy steals a maid uniform and a hospitality cart, and she ties a scarf around her head, and this part's really bad, but she talks in broken English, and she goes and knocks on the hotel room door, and they let her in. So Nancy kind of just does some little busy work, like she's pretending to dust and do things in the room, and she notices that the bathroom door is closed, and she thinks that Jasper has to be in there. And when she empties the room's trash can, she finds more of his drawings. So Nancy goes back to Frank and Joe, and she's looking at the outside of this motel building, and she notices that there's windows to the bathrooms. So she tells Frank and Joe, maybe you can sneak Jasper out the bathroom window while I pretend to bring towels into the room. So Nancy goes back for housekeeping round 2, and she goes in with towels and tries to go to the bathroom, but the man grabs her and won't let her go near the door. So she begins screaming in gibberish and throws an ashtray, kicks a trash can around, and topples the hospitality cart over, so the noise covers up Frank and Joe opening the bathroom window. And then for the grand finale, she yells at the kidnappers, "You clean up," and then runs back to the car. So Nancy, Frank, and Joe save Prince Jasper. His parents are eternally grateful, and I guess this mystery just shows us that teenagers make better personal bodyguards than the official ones. So there was not really anything to mention in a What's Cooking segment for this short story. We were too busy trying to find this kid. Now on to our third short story, The Haunted House. So this house is apparently haunted, so haunted they had to name it twice. But some of the characters that we see in this short story are Mr. and Miss Hardy, Aunt Gertrude, and Mr. Mitchell, who is just a campfire leader. So here's a quick synopsis for the haunted house. Nancy and the Hardy boys get to set up a haunted house for Halloween, but get more than they bargained for. Strings of jewelry robberies are happening in Bayport, and someone tries to sabotage their project. Could these things be connected? So at the beginning of this story, the Hardy boys have invited Nancy to Bayport to help them put on this haunted house for the Campfire organization, and their dad was going to help, but he's busy investigating some jewelry store robberies in the area. So what's kind of funny about this story is they have 3 houses that they can choose from, and the book doesn't really explain if these are just houses owned by relatives of Campfire members or what. But it's funny to me because them looking at 3 houses made me think of House Hunters, you know, that show on HGTV. Now I just need for this to be a thing, like Haunted House Hunters. That would be a really cool show. I can just picture it now. The Jankowski family is looking to move away from their boringly predictable cookie-cutter subdivision with an HOA and find something a little more ghoulish. Will they go with house number 1, a spooky southern mansion on the edge of a swamp, house number 2, a gothic Victorian with its own cemetery out back, or house number 3, a surprisingly unassuming condo where things go bump in the night? So Nancy and the Hardy boys decide on house number 3, which is the Lawrence Mansion, and they feel as if they're being watched when they're walking around inside the house. And when Nancy goes up to the 3rd floor after hearing a noise, she sees footprints in the dust, even though this place has been empty for years. No. Immediately no, I would leave, but of course Nancy doesn't, and she's poking around up there on the 3rd floor, and there's a stack of boxes that almost falls on top of her. So the Hardy boys come up there and check on her, and she says, yeah, they just fell over, and Nancy and the guys brush it off as just a draft, and I was like, what draft knocks over, like, huge boxes, though? I mean, that'd be about like me tripping over nothing but air and then blaming it on the house settling. You know, I am kind of a klutz. I may have to use that sometime. So completely unbothered bothered by this, they just continue their haunted house planning, and as they're leaving the house, Joe thinks he spots a face in a window on the 3rd floor. This just gives me the creeps just reading it, but when they get to the Hardy Boys' house, their dad, Fenton, which is a really cool name, I didn't know that was their dad's name, he says the robbers have struck again, and all they know is that they are 3 masked men, and one has a tattoo of an eye on his hand. I love how in the Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys universe, the villains can always be counted on to have weird tattoos or weird physical traits, but when they said eye tattoo on his hand, I was picturing like, did anyone else ever like draw eyes on the side of their hand and make their fingers like look like a mouth, like make their hand look like it was talking? Because that's all I could picture. So the book says that Joe and Frank go in their room to record spooky sound effects for the haunted mansion, and this just makes me laugh. I'm just picturing them like throwing stuff around and being like Foley artists. Like, it would be pretty entertaining to see. But while they're doing that, Nancy realizes that she forgot her sketchbook back at the mansion. So she goes back for it and she's like, I won't bother Frank and Joe. They're busy, you know, making ghost noises or whatever. So Nancy goes back to the mansion alone, which is a horrible idea because you just thought that someone might be there with you earlier. And I mean, you explained it away as a draft, but whatever. But Nancy is searching around for her sketchbook, and as she's leaving a room, she gets hit over the head and blacks out. So at some point, Frank and Joe get done with their spooky noise making, and they come outside of their room, and their mom is like, oh, Nancy went back to the mansion. She was looking for her sketchbook. And so they go to the mansion looking for Nancy because it's been a while since she left, and they find her laying in the mummy's sarcophagus, and there's a threatening note that's been written in her sketch pad. So the note says, stay away from Lawrence Mansion or else, signed the ghosts of the mansion. And Joe's response is cute. This is totally in line with Joe's character, and I love that he's not taking it seriously whatsoever. So the next day, Nancy and the Hardy Boys are going around and getting supplies for the mansion. They need costumes, and they witness the robbers that are stealing all this jewelry hitting a store in the mall, but they get away. So the book says that Nancy decides that she's going to dress up as a witch, Joe dresses up as a mummy, and Frank is the devil. And all the Nancy/Ned shippers said, I'm just kidding. Okay, though, we have to talk about how extra Nancy and the Hardy Boys are being with this haunted house, though, because it says in the book that there's like an inflatable slide that goes from one floor to the next, which is super cool, but it just made me think of the fact that my husband purchased a casket off of Facebook Marketplace, which we're using as a Halloween decoration. I just want to put that out there, and that's what it was used for before we got it. But I don't know if you've been on Facebook Marketplace in the last few years. It's like the wild, wild west. You can find pretty much anything you need and really don't need on there. Like, we found that casket, we found a slushie making machine, which, by the way, 5 stars. We made butterbeer slushies in that thing, and it was really, really good. If you know, Harry Potter reference. But also found a bookbinding machine on there, and I was able to use that to rebind some of my Nancy Drew books that were falling apart at the spines. So yeah, I just like to think that Nancy and the Hardy Boys, they, didn't have access to Facebook Marketplace, but they were probably just, going around and finding all these pieces for the haunted house, but they went all out with it. So Fenton, the Hardy Boys' dad, mentions that this little kid named Perry witnessed the robbers at the mall. So this will come back into play because he will be able to identify them if they show back up. So sure enough, on the night that they're doing this haunted house for Halloween, these 2 masked men come into the haunted house, and one has an eye tattoo on his hand. So Nancy warns Frank and Joe because I think she has walkie-talkies so they can communicate on the different floors of this house, and they make a plan when Nancy verifies that it is the robbers and they're trying to get through the locked door on the 3rd floor where they've hidden the jewelry that they've stolen. So they scare the robbers down this slide that they made in the haunted house and right into the policeman's arms. So there wasn't really any what's cooking for this short story, so we'll go on to the next short story, The Secret of Hawk Canyon. So for this short story, we do see Chet, Frank and Joe's friend, Kim Farrell, Mr. and Miss Farrell, and Ralph and Dick. So here's a quick synopsis for The Secret of Hawk Canyon. Nancy and the Hardy Boys go to Colorado to see Chet and stumble upon a missing person case and a quest for lost treasure. So Nancy, Frank, and Joe go to visit their friend Chet in Colorado, and from what I know about Chet, because I haven't really read any of the Hardy Boys books, he's kind of like the best of the Frank and Joe friend dynamic. So Chet always gets made fun of for what he likes to eat and what he looks like, so great. I bet he and Bess could have some very meaningful and interesting conversations. So Nancy and the Hardy Boys find Chet on the side of the road, and his bike ran out of gas, and he says that Kim Farrell, a Campfire girl, and her dad have disappeared. So Chet and some other people have organized a search party, so they're out looking for them, but Chet says that he's in Colorado originally because he's fascinated by Native American culture, and there's several cliff dwellings in the area. So when the group gets back to camp, they're told by some rangers that a note was found that says to stop looking for Kim, she won't be found. No ransom was asked for, though. So Nancy, Frank, Joe, and Chet get permission to search under the guise of a picnic. So they pack this picnic basket and they decide they're going to go out around where Kim was last said to have been seen. And one girl mentions that Kim had said something about Hawk Canyon. So the four friends go out to Hawk Canyon and they pretend to be picnicking, but they're really looking around for clues. And they see a girl's tennis shoe print near the stream, but they're not able to find any more clues. So they decide to sit down and have a real picnic, and then they take a nap. But Nancy wakes up before the others and decides to explore because she's like, maybe there's some other trace of Kim and her dad around here. So Nancy's able to find more footprints and a cliff dwelling, but she falls through a hole into the floor. And then meanwhile, Frank, Joe, and Chet wake up and they're like, where is Nancy? So they follow Nancy's footprints, and then eventually they hear her faintly calling for help. And turns out when Nancy fell through the floor and into that room, she found Kim and Mr. Farrell. They had fallen, and Mr. Farrell broke his ankle. And Kim was going to go back to get help because she didn't fall into the room initially, but two guys named Dick and Ralph showed up and they threw her into the hole with her dad. So the way that Kim explains it, she overheard Dick and Ralph's conversation, and Ralph's grandfather had a map to treasure that was supposedly hidden in the area. So Chet says that he'll take Kim and Mr. Farrell back to camp, and Nancy and the Hardy Boys decide they're going to set a trap up for the treasure hunters. So Nancy curls up in the kiva, or that's the name for the underground room that they were in, and pretends to be asleep, or worse, maybe she kind of looks like she's dead. But one of the thieves comes down to check on her because he's worried and wonders where Mr. Farrell is. He's like, well, there were two people in this hole, where is he? And so Nancy kicks him when he gets down there, hurries up the ladder, and pulls it out. And meanwhile, Frank and Joe have tied up the other thief, and they look at the map that they had, and it says behind the sixth house under the rocks in the third room on the right, 50 paces due north of the kiva. So they follow the instructions and they end up finding the hidden treasure, which is like ancient artifacts and jewelry, which are, I guess, Native American. And then these rangers show up and take the artifacts and the thieves into custody. So as far as a what's cooking segment for this short story, we got a mentioning of sandwiches, raw vegetables, fruit, and brownies that the group enjoyed on their picnic. Now on to our next short story, False Accusation. So some of the characters that we see in this short story are Karen Walker and her brother Bill, Roberta Walker, who is their mother, and Dawn Forrester, who is a campfire leader. Here's a brief synopsis for False Accusation. Nancy, Frank, and Joe meet the Walker family just as Bill Walker, the son, is getting taken to jail. Is it just a misunderstanding, and can the trio solve the case? So Nancy, Frank, and Joe are just out hanging out, and they duck into the doorway of this abandoned building because it starts to rain. And I'm sorry, but this started like a Francie or Jancy fanfic. But anyways, they think that this building is abandoned, but some kids and a couple of campfire leaders come out, and the campfire leader is Dawn Forrester, and he's there with Roberta Walker, whose daughter Karen is in the group. So they say that they're there because they're going to clean the building up, and Nancy and the Hardy Boys volunteer to help, and so they go inside, and while they're working, the police show up and say Bill Walker, Karen's older brother, has been arrested. So Roberta has to leave and go down to the police station with the police, and Karen mentions to Nancy that her brother Bill wants to be a detective, and she says that she hopes he didn't get into trouble because he was looking into some car break-ins in the area. So when Miss Walker eventually returns, she says that the police say Bill was seen running from the scene of a crash where a stolen car was was involved, and his fingerprints were found on the wheel, so it doesn't look good. So Nancy tells Roberta, she says, my dad's a lawyer, maybe he can help you all out, and so she agrees to at least talk to Carson, and so Bill, Karen, and Roberta go over to the Drews' house to eat dinner. And Frank and Joe Hardy are there too, and Bill is super rude to them, and he tells Nancy, Frank, and Joe that eventually he was in the car, but he says he saw it was unlocked and he was going to warn the owner, but while he was looking for the owner, the thief showed up and took the car. Just your classic case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So the next day, Bill goes missing, and Nancy and the Hardy boys go back to the marina to watch for the thief, and they find Bill about the same time that they see the thief. So Nancy distracts Bill while the Hardy boys follow the thief in their car. They're basically like, this kid has bungled things up, time for the professionals to step in. So Frank and Joe end up at some docks, and they see a big truck hauling away all these stolen cars, and Joe gets on the truck, and then he gets shut in by the bad guys, and Frank has no choice but to just follow the truck. So eventually Frank decides to pull over and call the police because he's like, we may be in over our head with this. But meanwhile, Nancy and Bill corner another one of the thieves on a boat. So everyone, Bill, Nancy, Frank, and Carson, get in a car and they search for Joe, and they eventually find the truck, and Joe is driving it. He's driving this big 18-wheeler, and so he got out when the driver stopped at a gas station, jumped up front in the cab, and then just took off. So they all earn rewards for catching the thief, and they end up donating the rewards to the Campfire group. I wish once, just once, Nancy would keep some kind of monetary reward for herself. If it ever happens in this series, I'm gonna be shocked. So as far as a what's cooking segment for this short story, we had fish and chips and orange juice. Now on to our last short story, The Abominable Snowman. So for this short story, our characters are Hannah Gruen, Max the Handyman, and Lucy Morgan, who's a friend of Nancy, Frank, and Joe. So here's a brief synopsis for The Abominable Snowman. Hannah's friend, Lucy Morgan, who owns a hotel, is also putting on a winter carnival, but things keep going wrong. Could it be sabotage or the Abominable Snowman? So Hannah says her friend Lucy Morgan has this hotel called the Candlewick Inn, and she's putting on a carnival to raise money for the Campfire organization. And I found this really interesting because they mention a specific project where they're going to restore the Statue of Liberty, but the Candlewick Inn kind of reminded me of the Sign of the Twisted Candles Inn. So Lucy says that their carnival has been sabotaged, and a booth was run over by a bulldozer, and several other things have happened lately. So the entire group goes to their cabin for the night, Nancy, Frank, Joe, and Hannah, and early the next morning, Nancy starts to hear noises outside their door. She goes to check it out, and she sees these huge footprints in the snow, and right after that, a ton of snow slides off the roof and on top of her. So Nancy's kind of able to laugh that off, but then later in the day, Miss Morgan asks the three detectives to check out the ski slopes and make sure that all the markers are ready. So the book says that Joe has been to this area before, and he thinks that the trail is off somehow. So he slows them down, and it's a good thing he does, because if they had kept going at full speed, they would have gone over a cliff. So someone moved the trail marker flags. That's messed up because they could have died or been severely injured. But next, Joe finds these robes in the booth's wreckage, the one that was bulldozed over, and Lucy says, oh, those are the robes for Carnival King and Queen. They're usually stored up in the attic. So when they go up to the attic, they find more footprints, so someone has been up there tampering with things recently. Now, next, Lucy mentions that her handyman, Max, doesn't seem very excited for the carnival, and I was like, okay, there's a big red flag right there. So later, when everyone goes back to the cabin, Hannah screams because there's this huge styrofoam snowman inside with a note on it that says, Snoops, get out of Pinecrest before someone gets hurt. I mean, I'm just spitballing here, but wouldn't the handyman have a key to the cabins? So next, Nancy, Frank, and Joe go to get a sleigh for Miss Morgan. It's like this sleigh that they use for the carnival, and there's an avalanche, and Max the handyman gets covered in the snow. He's just out there like traipsing around on the slopes. Basically, he's somewhere he's not supposed to be. story. But they save him from the avalanche, they find an oversized clown shoe, and he's the snowman. He's the Abominable Snowman. The end. This story didn't really have much suspense. It was pretty much like, yep, Max the handyman, he did it. And there was actually no cooking in this story, so there's no what's cooking segment for this short story. So if I had to pick a favorite story out of these short stories, I would probably pick the Haunted House. I really enjoyed that one. So that concludes this final Halloween episode and our discussion on Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys Campfire stories. I hope you guys enjoyed all these Halloween episodes. I had so much fun putting these together, and it was fun to kind of just break away from the regular episodes of the series and talk about some spookier stuff. So thank you guys for listening, and stay spooky.